It's all about creating the conversations. Arrow.net, ARROE.net. We are unplugged and totally uncut with Shawn Levy. I'm telling you, you have done something here that should have been done a long time ago. You don't need Google when you need this book. What we need are the words and experiences of of what you have put into these pages.
Thank you so much.
The journey had to have been incredible for you. Did you discover things that is like, oh my God, I didn't know this?
Oh, it was every day. You know, I'm 60 years old, so I remember a lot of these women performing on variety shows and talk shows when I was a boy, and you know that seeing women telling jokes they were rare, but they existed. I had no idea of how hard these women had to punch to get the shot at the mic, and you know what sort of preordained notions they had to shake out of people's heads in order to have successful careers.
See, I didn't know either until I started watching Marvelous Maisel. I mean, I didn't realize how tough it was to get that door open.
You know, in the late 50s, when Marvelous Mrs. Maisel starts, the narrative starts, if a woman stood in front of the microphone at a nightclub or some sort of vaudeville house or on a variety show, she was there to sing.
Yep.
There were maybe 6 women in the whole country who specifically told jokes. And it was such a rare thing that most of their careers, those women didn't even know about the others because they performed in narrow lanes. Moms Mabley was on the black showbiz circuit. Minnie Pearl was with country music in the Grand Ole Opry. Dean Carroll was in the Borscht Belt and nightclubs. So really, each one thought she was the only one. And man, you have to have some courage to do that.
Aren't they still in their private clubs? I mean, because even you can look at Chelsea lately and think, wow, she's in her own area, but is she chumming up with the other ones?
I believe that there's a camaraderie that exists between, any group where they figure we're not getting the breaks. They're all competing for the breaks, but at the same time, they can commiserate. And when in my book, you did find some people crossing over, Joan Rivers meeting with Toady Fields, Moms Mabley meeting with Rusty Warren and Phyllis Diller. These episodes are in the book. They're usually collegial because they look across the room and they see someone who lived what they lived. And that breaks down a lot of the, these women entered everything with their fists up and their elbows sharpened. And I think they could let their hair down a little when they were around someone else who had lived the same experience.
The book we're talking about is The Joke, the original queens of stand-up comedy. I've been in the room with Phyllis Diller, and it was a moment that I have never, ever let go of because she was so electrifying and so personal.
Phyllis Diller was an amazing person. She was a 37-year-old mother of 5 the first time she told jokes in front of an audience in the 50s in San Francisco. And she had a career of almost 70 years following that. And she read, not long before that debut, she read a book about positive thinking and making your life out of what you want it to be. And she really believed that philosophy. She gave away tens of thousands of copies of that book over the years. And I spoke to one of her sons. I spoke to perhaps a half a dozen people who worked with her and knew her. And everyone who encountered her came away with a positive impression. Mm-hmm. She was a genuinely warm and positive woman and also hilarious and hardworking and great at her art.
My daddy used to tell me all the time, he said, if she wasn't doing comedy, she'd be a preacher. She changes people's lives.
Yeah, I believe that. And she was a legit concert pianist. She performed more than 100 times with orchestras, and she could play a Beethoven concerto. She needed to. But I found reviews of her, and professional classical music critics were saying, I went there to laugh at her, and it turns out she's pretty good.
Now, one of the things that we've learned by watching Maisel is the fact that women did, she would take it across the line on the TV series, but in real life on that stage, did women have to play it safe and keep it clean, or were they allowed to step over that line?
Well, Maisel is set at the time when the line was shifting. Okay. There was a group of comedians came up in the late 50s, Lenny Bruce,
yes.
Mort Saul, Nichols and May. Elaine May is one of my protagonists. Woody Allen, Bob Newhart, and they were shifting comedy and opening it to new topics. And sometimes those topics were, from the bedroom, or they, involved, hot button political issues, or they were best illustrated by using sort of rude language. And Joan Rivers, in particular, among the women in this book, was sort of an inheritor of that cultural change. Even though she worked clean, in her many TV appearances at the time, she was doing psychological comedy about herself, sort of confessional. She made a lot of jokes, for many years about being a single girl trying to catch a fella. But she was someone who had been married, and the marriage was annulled, and then married again. And then she had to tell jokes about being married and having a baby. So the ground shifted underneath her, and she kept rolling with it. And when comedy became more permissive in the 70s with the likes of Richard Pryor and George Carlin, Joan Rivers could swear and throw the low blow as well as anyone.
Is that the reason why you describe it in the way of saying that you could not really define a type of comedy that a lot of these women were doing, because they were always changing, they were always evolving?
Right, and they all came from a slightly different place. So Elaine May came from the world of theater, but where she was in Chicago in the 1950s, they were literally inventing improv comedy and sketch comedy on the fly. And she was considered the best writer and best performer in the troupe that became Second City. And she was also one of the people who, when they sat down to figure out, okay, what are the rules of what we do and what don't we do? She was one of the main contributors to that. And those sort of guidelines are still being practiced every day. So she invented a type of comedy. She really did. And people who were there say, yeah, she was, I couldn't hold a candle to her. So each of these women found their own voice, their own métier, and their own audience.
Mm-hmm. You talk about where they came from. I think Roseanne Barr had to be one of the very first to step forward and say, I came from a world of darkness, really bad times, and I've turned it into comedy.
That's right. And I think that comedy was ready for that sort of voice at around that time. So she came along, and what she was doing fit with what was happening in comedy at the time. Phyllis Dillard came from a really kind of hard background, but she came up at a time when, comedians didn't talk about their lives unless they made fun of their lives. So she didn't talk about the difficult things she had to endure as a young woman or a young housewife.
In putting the book together, did you get the opportunity to step inside the lives in the way of? I always heard that Joan Rivers as well as Phyllis Diller always wrote their stuff down on recipe cards, and it's stored away in boxes. Did you get to touch any of that stuff?
No, because most of this book was written during lockdown and pandemic, so I didn't get to do a lot of travel, but Phyllis Diller's joke file is at the Smithsonian Institution, and there are something like 60,000 one-liners filed away like in an old-fashioned card catalog. Phyllis Diller, I watched old YouTube clips while I was working and timed her with a stopwatch, and she could tell 12 jokes in a minute. Bam, bam, bam. You may not like the first one, but somewhere along the way, she'd get you laughing. And then she was such a pro, she'd save the best ones for the end of the riff, and then you'd be howling. So you have to have a lot of jokes at your disposal if you're telling 12 in a minute and you're a headliner.
The psychology and the empowerment that they must have had while they were on that stage. Because, I've been with Pam Stone, and Pam Stone was a national comedian as well and appeared on television. To be in that moment, she said that before she went on that stage, she always had to pee. And she always talked about that. But what did these other comedians, did they do before they hit that stage?
Well, they all had their own thing. The main thing that they did was they had to sort of convince the world that they belonged there. Yes. When they came out, started telling jokes. Jean Carroll, who was a really forgotten figure, but really in many ways the first proper stand-up. She did not appear in a character. She didn't. Moms Mabley preceded her, but Moms did a character. Minnie Pearl preceded her, also in character. Jean Carroll stood in a gown and told jokes about being a mom, a wife, a woman shopping, the sort of stuff of life. But she said she would pick out the toughest looking guy in the front of the audience and work to him and try and get him to laugh.
Yep.
Because if she could get the sort of stereotypically most resistant member of the audience to go along with her, she knew that she could get everyone.
People like Jean Stapleton, very funny. Do you think she went into acting because she didn't understand the path to comedy, to be live on that stage? Because Jean was on a stage, but it was through acting, though.
Yeah. We could also talk about Carol Burnett, Lucille Ball, Mary Moore. I think it's a little bit of both ways. That when those women were coming up, there really were no women comedians. So you couldn't say, oh, I'm going to do what she does. There were one or two. And if you didn't happen to know who Moms Mabley was in 1950, you didn't think there were any black women telling jokes. So there was that. But also, several of the women in my book wanted to be actresses, and they were very funny, but they weren't necessarily great on stage. Joan Rivers thought she was an actress. And she appeared on, in these off Broadway, up a flight of stairs theaters in New York for years, including once with a high school student named Barbara Streisand in the cast. And, she was not good at it, but she was funny. And people said, have you thought of writing that stuff down? Have you thought of just telling jokes? And finally she decided, you know what? I see comedians, ordering the steak while I'm eating the lettuce sandwich. I'm going to try comedy.
Until I read about Minnie Pearl inside your book, that's the first time I've even heard her name in maybe 15, 20 years. And she is a comedian that deserves to have a lot more attention than what she's ever gotten.
Cheers to that. I agree. And frankly, at the beginning of my process, I thought Minnie Pearl, that's a corny old oddball act. She doesn't belong in here. And then I learned about her. She's a college-educated woman who trained for the theater. And when she was touring the South in small plays in the Deep South, met characters who were so countrified and charming and funny, these hardworking women living in rural areas, and she created this persona, Cousin Minnie Pearl, around that character. In reality, she was Sarah Colley. She was an expert golfer and tennis player. She owned a mansion next door to the governor of Tennessee's mansion, but she was always Cousin Minnie Pearl on stage. There's a wonderful story where she was shopping at the supermarket near her home, and a woman came up to her and said, I've been following you around the store because I knew you, and now I realize you're Minnie Pearl, but I didn't recognize you because you weren't smiling.
Oh.
And Minnie Pearl's character smiled. Sarah Colley was like you and me. She had her good days and bad days, but not Minnie Pearl. She never cried. She always had a laugh on for you.
Wow, I would have bet that the woman would have said because you didn't have a price tag hanging from the side of your hat. I never even thought about the smile.
Yeah.
Wow.
The price tag happened. She was doing the Cousin Minnie Pearl for years, and then one day didn't take the price tag off the little straw hat she'd bought for that night, and it got so many laughs, she kept it in, and it became her trade.
So breaking into the boys' club, Johnny Carson has to be able to get some praise here on this because he really did open up the door for a lot of them.
He did and he didn't. The book begins, Carson was one of these people who didn't think women were funny. He would have them on. He gave Joan Rivers the shot that turned her into an overnight star after 10 years. And he had her on many times and made her one of the permanent guest hosts of The Tonight Show. But he gave a very famous interview in 1978 when, the likes of Gilda Radner and Lily Tomlin and Elaine Boozler, Rita Rudner are in the business. Johnny Carson gave an interview to Rolling Stone magazine saying, comedy is too aggressive for women. There's one or two who can get away with it, but I think of it as a man's world. So he may have booked them, but, I don't think they felt he respected them. And, he spoke for a lot of people in the business, even when, you and I might think, wow, women in comedy have never had it better. they were still fighting that attitude every time they showed up to work.
You know what was missing from the 70s and stuff like that? I mean, Carlin had his album. I've never seen an album, a comedy album, from a woman.
Well, they all did them. Moms Mabley had about 15 or 20 albums on Chess Chicago. That's how she became known to white audiences. Until the mid-1960s, Moms had strictly played on black stages and black theaters. She'd been in a couple of shows that went downtown to Broadway from Harlem, but they came and went pretty quickly. So she was really a sort of inside phenomenon. Phyllis Diller cut records, Joan Rivers, Minnie Pearl, but very few of them were big sellers the way the men's records were, with the exception of the Dirty Singers. There were women who in the early 1960s cut, what were called in the business blue records. They would use profanity. And these records were on off labels and sold under the counter. There was a woman named Rusty Warren who was among the top 10 selling Billboard artists for the year in 1962 and 1963. She sold as many records in those years as Ray Charles or Elvis Presley or The Sound of Music. And then comedy changed, and someone who didn't quite use profanity seemed passé, but she was hugely popular. And there's a lot of baby boomers and even some Gen Xers who grew up, sort of snickering to their parents' Rusty Warren records and their Belle Barth records, the taboo ones that were in the back of the cabinet.
So, a broadcasting question to a journalist. Will you do a book on the female talent that have always stood in the shadows of the main talent on the radio show? Because there's a lot of females in radio that have gone ignored. Will you do anything like that?
It's a great subject. It's not my area of expertise. I'm really more a film guy, and I've written previously about comedians. I wrote a biography of Jerry Lewis. So I had some background in that, but this is the first I've ever given it a thought. So I'm not going to say no to something that could potentially be as rich as this, because I didn't know the story of really any of these women, and now some of them I just can't tell the world enough about how much they did and how hard it was and how they persevered.
It's so inspiring to hear that you were a student while you were putting this book together. That's very inspiring to a lot of writers.
Cheers. That's half the fun. I mean, if you live with me, it becomes a bit annoying because what's up to the Stiller fact of the day. But, to me, that's the joy of writing these stories is like, can you believe this? Do you know this? Look at who connected this. And I just dig that stuff. I always have. So writing biographies and pop culture histories is a way to share that enthusiasm and passion that's in my work with the world.
Wow. Shawn, you got to come back to the show anytime in the future. The door is always going to be open for you.
I appreciate that so much.
Excellent. Will you be brilliant today, okay, sir?
I'm going to try. It's still early. I'm on the West Coast.
Okay, guy. Bye.